there's quite a bit going on in the retirement space, and I'm sure the viewers are interested to see what our thoughts are. We have a little bit of a format change. We're going to start with a few quick hits. We're going to look at a survey that's very interesting, some recent research that has come to light in terms of the pandemic, and then some deep dives, particularly on the Secure Act this year. So let's talk first about some of the quick hits. Our first quick hit this month is on target date funds. Legislators have asked the Government Accountability Office to look into target date funds and retirement plans. So Allison, what will they be looking at specifically?
It's a pretty robust request, but some of the key themes include utilization of target date funds and of how many participants are using them, the behaviors of those who are defaulted to target date funds. Also looking a lot at risk profiles, how target date funds are invested, especially near and in retirement, what types of risks participants might be subject to. And then marketing is another big one. How are these funds communicated to participants, and are there potential misconceptions here?
The next headline is on the litigation front. Lowe has recently settled their ERISA lawsuit relating to their plan. And why don't you give us a little bit of background on what was going on here and what the settlement entails?
In this case, Lowe was accused of a couple of fiduciary breaches, largely related to the services provided by their advisor, who was Aon Hewitt, specifically around Aon recommending and selecting proprietary product for the plan. And fundamentally, the accusations against the Lowe's fiduciaries was that they allowed that to happen, that they didn't properly review and monitor Aon's activities. So they're going to settle this case for $12.5 million, but perhaps more notably, they have agreed that within the next year, they're going to hire a consultant to help them do an RFP to evaluate other advisors.
So if I'm to understand this situation accurately, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Aon was the delegated fiduciary or the 338 investment manager for the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? And then they were actually choosing funds that they constructed to fill the menu of the plan. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Okay. And what type of conflict or what did the suit say about that?
Well, the suit but participants allege certainly that Aon breached its fiduciary responsibilities. Clearly, selecting their own product brings conflicts of interest. There's potential compensation overlaps there. What was alleged of the fiduciaries, though, is they still had a responsibility, even though they outsourced the investment decision making to Aon. They were still responsible for monitoring Aon and ensuring that Aon was acting prudently. And the participants in the suit alleging, it should have been pretty clear that the fiduciaries would have seen Aon selecting its own proprietary product and should have recognized that conflict of interest, and that there wasn't sufficient monitoring given that that was allowed to occur.
Mm-hmm. And so what should have the Lowe's Investment Committee done to sort of protect themselves from this?
Yeah, so it's interesting. RFP is kind of a course of action we see oftentimes, usually as a big process, often reserved for when committees know they want to make a change. But we think there's a lot of other activities that committees can engage in to monitor advisory firms like Strat in advance of doing that full RFP. Simply having a conversation about the services and ensuring that the committee understands the processes the advisor is using. Talking to other advisory firms on an ad hoc basis to understand the marketplace, whether that's direct conversations or asking even a current advisor to help facilitate those conversations. Ensuring fees are reasonable is also important. Getting some high-level quotes from other advisory firms to compare current fees and services. Those are all steps that a company could engage in advance of looking to a full-blown RFP.
That's great. Thanks, Allison. Let's move on to the next headline with respect to the record-keeping universe and a big transaction that just was recently announced.
Yeah, we continue to see a lot of moving pieces for plan administration. We have just had the announcement that Aon will be spinning off and divesting their retirement business. That's going to include their actuarial services and their pension administration services, along with the pooled employer plan or PEP that they created effective 1/1. They're doing this transaction with a private equity firm, and it's looking like they're going to set that up as a standalone business. They're doing this in order to complete the proposed merger with Willis Towers Watson, who also offers actuarial and pension administration services. So, needing to move on one of those businesses to avoid potential antitrust or anti competitive type concerns.
Okay, so you have to clarify this for me because I'm a simple person. So they're selling the Aon Retirement Plan Administration and buying the Willis Towers Watson administration. So net, they're still going to be in the business under just a different umbrella.
That is our understanding. There's definitely still more to come as far as ongoing branding. Aquiline, the private equity firm that is going to be purchasing the business from Aon, we'll expect new branding to come in there so that former Aon, future Aquiline partnership will have a new brand name. Also unknown what the ongoing branding will be for the future merged entity of current Aon and Willis Towers Watson, whether they're going to retain the Aon branding or go with a new name. So yes, it is definitely going to be confusing.
All right, more to come there. So let's move on to the survey of the month. So we had a recent survey that the Plan Sponsor Council of America issued on committees and committee structure, and there's a lot of great information in here. So why don't you give us the headlines of what the survey was focused on and some of the outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. We get a lot of questions from clients on, how they should structure their committee, what other companies are doing. And this was a great survey that looked at companies kind of across various sizes to really get a sense of the types of folks that are on committees, the number of committees, some of their responsibilities, as well as some of their ongoing practices, especially frequency of meeting is always a really hot topic. I think the first thing we want to pull out is number of committees. About 64% of companies reporting that they're really using a single committee to oversee the plan, rolling up responsibilities in one committee. That means around 35% of companies using more than one committee. I can tell you in our experience, using multiple committees is most common in larger companies. That was consistent with the survey results, but also where there's multiple plans like DBDC, DC non-qual, more likely to potentially consider splitting responsibilities. Maybe there's an administrative committee and an investment committee, for example.
So perhaps just give some examples of what the differences in responsibilities would be between an investment committee and an administrative committee.
Sure. So, in that type of structure, the investment committee oftentimes dedicated just to the investment related elements, kind of focused on selecting and monitoring investments, working directly with the investment advisor. Whereas an administrative committee would more likely be charged with oversight of the plan's record keeper, establishing the processes to administer the plan, focus more on employee communication and education type processes, and then perhaps charged with plan design as well, determining the actual features of the plan. Or that could even be segmented off into a third committee, just depending on organizational preferences.
And just a side question, is there any anecdotal evidence as to whether one or two committees works better?
You know, um, I would say no. Either structure could work equally well or equally not well, depending on the organization and those available to participate in the process.
Mm.
At the end of the day, we think it's most important that those responsibilities are clearly defined and documented, and that there's a good process to actually carry out those responsibilities on an ongoing basis. And to that point, the survey did find, or we had almost 80% of companies reporting that their committee structure is defined and documented. In our experience, that number is probably a little bit high. We know a number of companies say, yeah, actually, if we really, have to go find the documentation, it's very, very old and maybe a little bit out of date. So always a good idea every couple of years to pull out those documents, make sure you can find them, and they actually say what you think they say.
And there's some interesting stats on membership and how you get on the committee and
Mhm.
diversity of the committee. So maybe comment on what we saw in the study from that perspective.
Yeah, far and away, folks noting job title was the most common reason that an individual was on the committee. Expertise was the second most common, followed by really willingness to participate. We were really happy to see willingness to participate. I think that one can't be kind of undervalued. Having folks that are able to attend meetings and excited to participate is really valuable to the fiduciary process. We didn't see certain things like employee representation or diversity and inclusion as reasons that were really driving committee membership.
And a big question we get, or a lot, and you get in particular, is should we have legal counsel, internal legal counsel on our committee, and or should external legal counsel participate in these meetings? What were the findings there?
Yeah, so the majority of companies reporting that they do not regularly have internal or external counsel attend, either that those folks didn't participate or that they would only kind of participate on an as needed or very ad hoc basis. Of those companies that reported having counsel, it was about a third of them were using internal resources versus a relatively small percentage consistently having outside counsel attend. Those numbers do shift to larger companies more likely to use legal representation, which makes sense given increased complexities of larger plans, but also likely kind of increased access to some of those resources both internally and externally. But still seeing even among larger plans, the majority certainly not leveraging those resources on a consistent and regular basis.
Yeah. Any other interesting tidbits from the survey worth mentioning?
I will highlight the survey noted about 74% of companies do not rotate committee membership. That one was interesting. I would say that's also consistent with our experience, but that's a question that comes up not infrequently about, should membership rotate by definition? There's definitely pros and cons to rotating membership. On the one hand, rotating membership can bring in new perspectives to the committee. On the other hand, these plans are really complex, and a lot of organizations don't have a huge depth of resources that have the expertise or the availability to participate in the committee. So sometimes there's benefits to when you get good members to keep them and keep the process moving really smoothly.
And what about committee size? That's often a frequently asked question.
Yeah, maybe I'll say one of my disappointments from this survey was they didn't get too granular here. They only asked about 5 or less members or 5 to 10 members. They did find 5 to 10 was the most common amount, but didn't exceed 0 to 5 by a huge margin. Would have loved to see that question a little bit more granular. I think we see most commonly either 5 members or 7 members, but the survey definitely indicated very few companies have 10 or more members. So that's another way to keep things moving efficiently.
Yeah, they should have asked how many members do you routinely have showing up for your committee meetings?
Hopefully the majority.
So that's a great survey, and thanks for sharing that. And we'll look forward to next month's, and we'll also be able to share some of our data in relation to that survey. So let's move on to some recent research that's been in the marketplace, specifically with the pandemic. There's some really interesting things that you found in terms of how the pandemic has affected retirements.
Yeah, anecdotally, we heard throughout the year last year companies saying we're seeing increased retirements, but we've got some data to support that now. And the New School did some research, and their findings from the jobs reports is that the number is about 1.7 million additional retirements last year above the regular rate of expected retirement. So, putting some hard data to that. They also dug into who was retiring and kind of how the pandemic impacted that. And they did find, while retirements were up, specifically for those over age 65, when you bifurcated the data, there was a really notable difference between those with and without college degrees. And actually, those without college degrees saw much higher rates of retirement across all the age groups studied, 55 to 64 and 65 plus. And those numbers were even higher specifically for Black workers without college degrees. That is not as good of news, as the data also shows there's a huge disparity in wealth accumulation among those groups. Specifically, Black workers without college degrees, as of the end of 2019, their median retirement savings was about $9,000 as compared to $167,000 for their peers.
Wow.
So huge disparity in wealth there, and what the data seems to support and what we've seen anecdotally is, workers without college degrees generally leaving the workforce and retiring less by choice, more so because their jobs were eliminated. That's supported by the data in the BLS reports. And given the relatively more limited resources of this population, they may be looking to tap Social Security early. That means lower Social Security payments and ultimately higher risk of poverty.
And do you think, given the significant number of unemployed people and the significant number of job openings, that some of those people will come back to work?
It is definitely possible. We'll see some of them returning to the labor force. And in fact, the researchers that put this study together suggested, perhaps some targeted programs to help, ensure that there's some job creation that could potentially support these folks as jobs are returning, that they're returning in formats that these folks are able to ultimately participate in. A lot of these workers as well are in more manual type labor and labor that becomes a lot harder to do as you age.
And when you may or may not know this answer, but when they had said they attributed these retirements to the pandemic, what in particular was the root cause here?
Mhm. So some of them was definitely job loss. Some of them they did attribute, from the pandemic, but more to market performance. There certainly seemed to be some evidence, especially among um, workers with college degrees who were over age 65 that perhaps had delayed retirement previously, that strong financial market performance did support them moving out of the labor force. Ultimately though, that 1.7 million number comes from a baseline expectation based on demographics and prior year behaviors, how many people were expected to retire, and then the actual number of individuals reporting that they had retired in excess of that baseline amount.
So, like many numbers on a comparative year-over-year basis we've seen from the pandemic, this is another one that has outsized results, and we'll have to look at it again next year to see if it corrects itself. Let's move into the deep dive. The Secure Act 2.0. That's a big news item and has a lot of potential changes. I mean, we've been through it several times, and there is more than one video uh, can surmise here. So, why don't you just take us through the highlights of what the Secure Act 2.0 is, and then we can dive in.
So before we dive into the provisions of what's being termed Secure Act 2.0, I first want to acknowledge there's a lot of legislative proposals out there. There's a lot of broad proposals out there, both in the House and in the Senate. A lot of these bills include similar provisions. So if you're hearing different names of legislation and you're thinking, I thought that bill was called something different, you're not mishearing. There are a lot of bills out there. There's a number of specific proposals out there as well that would have more targeted impacts on retirement plans and introduce specific provisions. And a lot of these proposals are also being incorporated into some of these broad bills. So things like emergency withdrawals, things like creating a database of former employee accounts are also present in some of the broad proposals. So there's still some uncertainty about what may ultimately end up in a bill, but we think increasingly likely day by day that we're going to see a broad retirement bill move forward. So let's dig into some of the provisions that are in this Secure Act 2.0. The bill is actually called Securing a Strong Retirement Act, but it's really building on a lot of the themes from the Secure Act back in 2019, hence the nickname. There are really five key areas that the provisions can be bucketed into. So we'll dig through some of the different provisions and what their impacts may be. The first key theme of what these bills are trying to accomplish is expanding coverage or really expanding access to retirement plans. Some of the ways that they're looking to do that: expanding tax credits available to small businesses and to savers to participate in retirement plans, sponsor benefits. Also looking to further change some of the rules for part time employees. One of the key provisions here would be the requirement that all new plans use automatic enrollment and automatic increase. So, really trying to be sure people are actually in the plans when they're offered.
And do any of these coverage expansions fall outside of current plans? For instance, people who aren't covered by plans?
Potentially, one of the biggest gaps in coverage is small businesses not offering plans. There's some other provisions to try to encourage the use of pooled employer plans, for example. So, really looking at companies, especially smaller companies that don't have a corporate type retirement plan today.
Great.
So, another key bucket of potential provisions here is around improving savings levels. So, some of the provisions in the bills include changes to required minimum distribution age. Specifically, this bill is proposing to push that out to age 75 by the year 2033. Also, looking at expanding catch up contributions. The proposal here would let those who are age 62, 63, or 64 contribute an additional $10,000, so beyond the standard catch up contribution requirement. Somewhat interesting, I don't know that a lot of folks know this. There's actually a prohibition in ERISA to give incentives to individuals for participating or saving. So, a raffle or a gift card, a free lunch. You can provide incentives for going to an education meeting, for example, but you can't actually provide that incentive to someone for participating or saving at a higher level. So there's actually a proposal to change that. So you could potentially do those types of things and, give people, the chance to win a new iPad if they're participating in the plan or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's we've always talked about that. That's a great way to incent people to attend a meeting or to increase their contributions. A lot of these things, however, are not pro revenue for the government. They are definitely going to hurt revenue. So, what do you think the impetus is here for the government to sort of propose these things?
Well, retirement readiness and financial wellness are definitely considerations that's driving, a lot of these proposals and wanting to make sure that, individuals have resources to save for retirement and are able to use and fully kind of access some of the benefits of these programs. Another key theme of the bill is simplification. I think we can all acknowledge that these plans and some of the requirements are really complicated. So there's a whole wide range of proposals that are intended to simplify administration, simplify compliance requirements, things like directing the DOL and the PBGC to look at required notices and streamlining those, changing some of the requirements of who has to get notices, when, and how. Looking at small balances, potentially expanding those that can receive automatic distributions from the plan, looking at an option to turn over uncashed checks to the Treasury Department versus maintaining those. So that all falls in the realm of simplification. Clarification, also important, kind of clarifying some of the prior um, legislation. For example, the Secure Act created a new type of special withdrawal for birth of a child or adoption, clarifying that that can be repaid within 3 years. Another withdrawal being proposed here, this one allowing a penalty free withdrawal for victims of domestic abuse. That is a really interesting theme that we're seeing as well. More and more proposals to create different types of withdrawals. So, really putting potentially quite a lot of focus for committees and thinking about if those are reasons why they are willing to let people withdraw from the plan while still employed.
Yeah, that's great. And the other one that was interesting that's mentioned here, maybe you can comment on, is the clarifying target date fund benchmarking.
hmm Yep. So this really ties to some of the fee disclosure regulations. There are some General areas that can make it difficult to determine what benchmarks should be shown in a target date fund or in a fee disclosure for target date funds. Some of the guidelines would suggest that perhaps a blended benchmark is not appropriate and it has to be kind of a security specific benchmark. Now, for something like target date funds that are a blend of multiple asset classes, that doesn't necessarily make sense. So, looking to have that reviewed and potentially updated so that more meaningful benchmarks are being used in fee disclosures. Well, really, the last key set of provisions we'll call the revenue provisions. Will, as you indicated, some of these things, a lot of these things will cost the government money. A lot of tax deferral and just delayed receipt of taxes, not necessarily tax avoidance, but trying to make it revenue neutral in the near term. Two of the biggest provisions that this bill has included to try to pay for these changes first would require that all catch up contributions be Roth contributions or after tax contributions. So, no longer able to have any of those additional contributions for those over age 50 be done pre tax. The other provision would be an option to allow employees to include matching contributions in their current year taxable income. This one's really interesting as well. It'd be an employee election to basically treat their match as a Roth and say, hey, count that against my taxable income this year. Someone could functionally achieve the same outcome with a Roth in plan conversion of taking those matching contributions and, if the plan allows, converting them to a Roth. But a way that I think the government is thinking, hey, maybe more people would opt into that option versus doing those conversion transactions. And that would ostensibly raise some revenue.
Yeah, great. So all of this, there's a lot here. What are the next steps and what can we expect to hear more on this?
Yeah, well, this Securing a Strong Retirement is the bill that's probably made it the furthest so far. It was unanimously approved by the House Ways and Means Committee, so really a sign of the bipartisan support. No date yet as far as when it may get a vote on the floor of the House, but is expected to pass. With the similar bills moving forward in the Senate, those will need to go through kind of committee. But if we can get a vote on one of those bills in the Senate, get this bill voted on in the House, then that would take Congress into a kind of a conference committee to hammer out some of the differences and ultimately move something forward. So there are a few steps, but again, highly likely that we're going to see a package move through this year.
Well, that's great. Any parting thoughts here as we wrap up this month's update?
Yeah, I'll just note on the legislative front, of course, keep in mind it'll be big headlines, but few, if any, changes will need to be made this year. We're still working through changes from the Secure Act in 2019, so these things definitely don't move quickly.
Well, thanks, Allison, for the update, and thanks for all of you for tuning in, and we look forward to enjoying our summer, and we'll be back sometime after the 4th of July and give you another update.